Greetings and salutations, Ranting Engineer back. I'm going to continue on with this series about a plan for Canada. So in the previous three videos, we've talked about how we set up a system for survival based on things like water, heat, food. So before we can go from survive to thrive, and we're going to have to talk about excess, because a lot of the times what we think is thriving is actually excessive, and we got to have a serious think about that when it comes in relation to energy and economy. So before we can move away from the survive portion, we have to look at our systems that we rely upon to survive and make things like redundancy, longevity, if you want to say durability, and sustainability. So we've got to look at that. So the analogies, I'm going to use this. In design, when you look at redundancy, you can do it a couple different ways. So the two main principles we'll talk about is, say I have a piece of equipment. I'll pick a pump. I can have a pump and a 100% standby pump. So if the first pump fails, I have 100% redundancy, and the second pump can pick it up. It has to switch over, but I've got a pump basically just sitting there not being used on standby. In some cases, that makes sense in design. The other side of it you could do is you can have 5 smaller pumps with a certain amount of excess capacity that if one pump dies, the other 4 can pick up speed and handle the one pump being down. So again, there's 2 types of redundancy. When I look at, say, food and energy systems in Canada, we have a bit of both, but we're more like the second one. I think we need to get better when we come to the second one. So let's take this analogy to food. So we've got a handful of very big meat packing plants in Alberta that supply about 1/3 of Canada, I've been reading. So if we have a whole bunch of butchers all over the place, we have extra redundancy. So if one butcher went down for some reason, the other butchers can kind of bring up the capacity. So this is the thing, is there's no real one by 100% systems when it comes to food. We can't have that. We can't have one Cheerio factory, because no one's going to build a Cheerio factory and have a second Cheerio factory. Inside that Cheerio factory, they're going to have redundancy, okay? But the factory itself, they don't have redundancy. So you can understand why we have to be very careful about redundancy in Canada in our system. So let's talk about energy. If, for whatever reason, the natural gas system failed in Canada, what is our redundant system for heat? We really don't have one, okay? Now, natural gas supply is actually extremely reliable because I was saying before, it's a gas that flows easily. You have compressors. They have redundant compressors. But this will get to my point later about sustainability. So we've got to think about redundancy. We've got to think about we have enough stuff. So my point is, when it comes to food, we got to get better at small businesses, okay? And the current government really doesn't like small business. At least it doesn't look that way. But if you have more smaller businesses, you've got more redundancy, okay? And we need to support that. I know we like our Walmarts. I'm not anti-Walmart or anything like that, but I've realized to have survival and a good economy, we need lots of small businesses. So we need to focus on that. We need to support that. This will also goes into craftsmanship, which will be I'll talk about that in a different thing. We got to get better at craftsmanship. We got to get better at making things that last. Anyways, this gets into sustainability. So let's make the assumption that that we have a finite below subterranean hydrocarbon supply. Now, I'm not going to get people up in arms. I have no idea how big it is. We have lots of gas. We have lots of oil. We actually have a lot of oil right now that's not economical to produce, but it's there. The reserves are there. So when they talk about the reserves of oil sands being some of the largest in the world, they're right. Just not all of it can be easily obtained right now. But let's assume that at some point that's going to run out. Again, there's a finite supply. How fast we get to the end of it, that's part of the thrive and access part. It's how fast we use it. But at this point in time, let's make the assumption at some point in the future, who knows when, there will be not, we'll exhaust the hydrocarbons that we have subterranean. So before that point, we have to look at what can we do for sustainable energy. This is where we talk about the pallets of brown, if you want to talk renewables. Well, when you look at longevity and durability and factor that in of the green energies, there's only two that rise to the top. It isn't wind, it isn't solar, and it isn't even the inline turbines that I've talked about for hydro, which I kind of like. Those are short term. Why? Because we already know from the recent studies, the reports off Denmark, people are starting to become aware wind turbines have a finite life, and it's less than a decade. They just wear out. The metal, the bearings, the fiberglass of the blades that go around that I talked about in previous videos. So when they get 10 years, that's not very durable. That's not sustainable. Because if we have a finite amount of hydrocarbon resource, i.e. to make fiberglass, that's not going to work. Already talked about solar panels. Solar panels have a little bit longer life, but they break down. Well, if we don't have infinite hydrocarbon to help form the silicon, the arc furnaces, and everything else, solar power is not that durable, not that long term. So what does that leave? That leaves hydroelectric dams and nuclear. And that's probably going to blow your mind. You're thinking, what? Hydrocarbon dams, especially with Site C, everybody's up in arms about how much energy, how much damage. Yes, when you create the dam, and I've talked about this in previous videos, you create a huge carbon footprint. Huge. No one's debating that. But when you look at the durability of a dam, and yeah, there's certain components inside that wear out, but you can have spare parts made. We need to take our limited hydrocarbon before it runs out and use it to construct these dams through concrete, through diesel-powered vehicles. They construct these dams because when you think about it, the earth does some work for us. So the water that goes through the dam that we use to create electricity eventually gets evaporated, turns on rain, comes back down on the earth, and goes back down through the river. So it's a cycle. It's like a recycle. Okay, people call it renewable and sustainable and green. No. It's a recycle. The water recycles itself through basically Earth. Okay, so from that standpoint, moving forward as a redundancy, as something sustainable and more long term, hydroelectric dams to provide electricity is the way to go. Now the other side is nuclear. And I talked about nuclear before. You've got to put a shitload of energy into the concrete, into the mining, everything else. But once you get going, nuclear is actually long-term sustained, again, to create electricity. Now this opens the Pandora's box, talking about how are we going to transition in whatever time frame it is, away from hydrocarbon-powered vehicles into electric. This is the problem. So you look at the amount of vehicles on the road. We'd have to replace them with electric vehicles, which could be done over time. However, do you think we have enough of the battery resources on this planet to be able to do that? That's the problem, okay? It's not that electric cars aren't potentially viable, but are you going to replace 1 billion cars with batteries that wear out over time, knowing that we also have a limited amount of materials available to us? So in the next short term, we can start back on hydrocarbon. We can do a backbone of hydrocarbon, get going, but we need to be smart about how we're going to use that finite amount of hydrocarbon. It might be 400, 1,000 years from now where we run out, but at some point we run out. Then we got to look at transitioning to something that's recyclable. So this brings up the thing of wood again. Wood is a long-term regenerative. Okay, it takes a long time. It takes the CO2 out of the atmosphere, creates carbon in plant form that we can use and can burn. In corn, we can make ethanol. It's not the most efficient. But considering we have a finite subterranean hydrocarbon source, we need to start thinking about this palette of browns. So moving forward into Canada, we need a plan to go, okay, we have a certain amount of resources internally. We need to do this for ourselves, to set ourselves up for the future. So we need to create dams. We need to use the energy to forge things like the copper, the electrical networks to do this. We need to start looking at, okay, if we're going to create ethanol for the future, we need to have a plan. We might not enact it now, but we need to have a plan for it. This leads to how do we properly use our economy to keep ourselves sustained. So I was having a chat with a buddy tonight. One of the things that we transition from survival to thrive is we sell commodities to other people. Well, oil prices right now are dictated by international supply. Well, it's not easy. The math is tough to do. The economics are hard to go against. But if you think about if we use our own hydrocarbons, refine them to use our internal structures to fuel our own economy, our backbone, to take care of ourselves, to start building this infrastructure that is long-term sustainable, you basically could take the oil out of the ground, add your production cost, add a bit of a markup because somebody needs to make money off this. Okay, do your refining, add a little bit of markup, and sell it to ourselves internally. Okay, at sustained prices. We might pay a little bit more over time, but we can sustain our economy. But we need that plan. Okay, I still look at the Liberal government that they don't have a plan. The problem is they're too far to the outsides. Okay, we got one side that is got to go hydrocarbon, now we're going to run out, we got to do this for the economy. We've got the Greens on the other side going, everything needs to go green. Everything. You understand that there's a middle ground. We have to be realistic. You have to look at the recyclable technologies, the sustainable technologies, and use our finite resources to guide ourselves towards that. But we have to be realistic. So one of the things this is getting to is it's going to come down to us having to put in more personal effort. Okay? I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to do another video where I'm going to talk about craftsmanship. And we're going to talk about how we have to get better at making things that last longer, which is going to go into this. We talk about durability, sustainability, etc. So as we continue this plan, we've got to think about energy, how we use it, how it can be finite. We don't know the timeline. We got to think about how we thrive in a way that moving forward has a plan that's sustainable for all of Canada. And we got to think about all of Canada because we got this palette of resources, the palette of browns that I've ranted about. Now we have to think about effectively using them. If we start effectively using them, implementing all these programs, we will keep people busy. We will have an economy that will eventually thrive, but we won't get into excess. And that's where we're at now. We're burning through energy too high. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. It gives you something to think about, how we move forward into thriving from just survival. We got to get the survival part right. All right, you guys have a good evening. We'll talk to you later.